Imagine standing on a battlefield in October 1781. The ground shakes under your feet. The air is filled with smoke, and the smell of gunpowder stings your nose. Around you, thousands of soldiers stand in rows. But something is different about this battle, something the British didn't expect, something that would change American history forever. This is the story of the secret weapon that beat the Redcoats at Yorktown, the battle that ended the American War of Independence. Most people know Yorktown as the final battle of the American Revolution, but few understand the real reason why the British, thought to be the most powerful military force in the world at the time, were completely defeated. It wasn't just strategy. It wasn't just courage. It was a specific weapon, an unexpected force that took the British Army completely by surprise. And today, you'll discover exactly what it was, how it worked, and why it was so powerfully effective. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this content, please hit the subscribe button now and leave a comment letting us know what time you're watching this video. This will greatly help the channel grow and continue bringing you fascinating stories like this. To understand Yorktown's secret weapon, we must first go back in time and understand the background of the war. By 1781, the American War of Independence had already lasted 6 long years. The American colonists were fighting the British Empire, the world superpower of the time. It was like David versus Goliath, but on a much larger and much deadlier scale. The British Army was feared worldwide. Its soldiers, known as Redcoats because of their bright red uniforms, were considered almost unbeatable. They had conquered lands on every continent. Their navy ruled the seas. Their generals were trained at the finest military schools in Europe, and their equipment was the most advanced available at the time. The Americans, on the other hand, were mainly militiamen, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who picked up weapons to defend their freedom. They lacked the formal training of the British. Their uniforms were mixed, if they had any at all, and their weapons were often their own hunting tools. Many of them had never seen battle before joining the revolutionary cause. In the early years of the war, the Americans suffered defeat after defeat. New York fell. Philadelphia was occupied. It seemed the rebellion would be crushed, and the colonists forced back under British rule. But something changed in 1778. France, still angry from its defeat to the British in the 7 Years' War, decided to enter the war on the American side. This partnership with France was absolutely crucial, but not in the way most people think. Yes, the French sent soldiers. Yes, they provided weapons and supplies. But the real secret weapon they brought to the war was something far more powerful, far more impactful, and far more devastating to the British. It was something that would completely change the balance of power in North America. Fast forward to the summer of 1781. General Charles Cornwallis, commander of British forces in the South, had chased the American army through the Carolinas and Virginia. His troops were tired but confident. Cornwallis had received orders to set up a naval base on the Virginia coast. He chose the small port town of Yorktown, located on a peninsula between the York and James rivers. Cornwallis had about 7,500 soldiers under his command. He immediately began strengthening Yorktown, building trenches, redoubts, and fortifications. He was confident he could survive any American attack. After all, the Americans had no navy capable of blocking the harbor, and even if they surrounded the city, the British Navy could easily resupply or evacuate their troops by sea. But Cornwallis didn't know one thing. He didn't know that George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau, commander of French forces in America, were planning something extraordinary. They were organizing an operation that would require perfect coordination between land and naval forces, precise timing across hundreds of miles, and a level of secrecy nearly impossible to maintain. George Washington at this time was camped near New York with his army. He had spent months planning an attack on the city, which had been occupied by the British since 1776. But when he received news that a large French naval fleet was sailing for America, commanded by Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, Washington saw an opportunity simply too good to pass up. Admiral de Grasse's fleet was huge, 28 ships of the line, the largest and most powerful warships of the time. Each of these ships carried between 60 and 80 cannons. They were floating fortresses capable of destroying coastal cities or fighting entire fleets. And de Grasse had agreed to sail to the Chesapeake Bay, exactly where Cornwallis was fortifying himself at Yorktown. This was the secret weapon. It wasn't a new technology. It wasn't an innovative tactic. It was naval power on a scale the British hadn't expected to face in the Americas. It was the ability to control the sea, to completely blockade Cornwallis, and prevent him from receiving reinforcements or escaping. It was the tool that would transform Yorktown from a strong defensive position into a death trap. But there was a gigantic problem. For the plan to work, Washington needed to move his army from New York to Virginia, a distance of over 400 miles, without the British realizing his intentions. If the British discovered the plan, they could attack the American army as it marched, or they could evacuate Cornwallis from Yorktown before the siege began. Washington was a master of deception. He began to trick the British into thinking he was preparing a massive attack on New York. He built fake bread ovens near the city, suggesting he was preparing for a long campaign. He conducted obvious scouting of British defenses. He even leaked false information through spies he knew were working for the British. Meanwhile, Washington was secretly moving his troops south. In August 1781, the American army and French forces under Rochambeau began their march. They moved quickly but carefully, avoiding main roads whenever possible. Washington had divided his forces into multiple columns to confuse observers about their true numbers and destination. The march to Yorktown was one of the most impressive logistical operations of the war. Moving more than 7,000 American soldiers and 5,000 French soldiers, along with their supplies, artillery, and equipment, across hundreds of miles of territory, was an enormous challenge. They needed food, water, shelter, and ammunition. They needed to cross rivers and travel through mountains, and they needed to do it all quickly before the British realized what was happening. When the British in New York finally realized Washington had left, it was too late. The American army was already halfway to Virginia. Worse still for the British, Admiral de Grasse's fleet had already reached the Chesapeake Bay. French ships immediately began blocking the bay's entrances, preventing any British ships from reaching Yorktown. On September 5, 1781, the British Navy arrived in the Chesapeake Bay with 19 ships of the line, commanded by Admiral Thomas Graves. Graves expected to find the bay unguarded and to be able to resupply Cornwallis without opposition. Instead, he found the larger and better-positioned French fleet waiting for him. What followed was the Battle of the Virginia Capes, also known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. This was one of the most important naval battles in American history, though it rarely receives the recognition it deserves. The two sides faced each other in a fierce battle that lasted for hours. Cannons roared, ships shattered. The water was filled with wreckage and men. The naval battle was not decisive in terms of ships sunk. Both sides suffered significant damage, but it was decisive strategically. The French maintained control of the bay. Graves, after assessing the damage to his fleet and realizing he was outnumbered, decided to return to New York for repairs. This decision sealed Cornwallis's fate. With the French fleet controlling the Chesapeake Bay, Cornwallis was completely isolated. He couldn't receive reinforcements. He couldn't receive supplies, and he couldn't evacuate his troops. He was trapped at Yorktown with just over 7,000 soldiers, facing a combined army of 16,000 Americans and French that was rapidly closing in on his position. Washington and Rochambeau arrived at Yorktown in late September. They immediately began laying siege. French and American forces completely surrounded the city, cutting off all land escape routes. Cornwallis had built good fortifications, but now they became his prison. But let's get back to the secret weapon. Yes, French naval control was crucial. Without it, the siege could never have happened. But there was another element of the French contribution that was equally, perhaps even more important to the final outcome of the battle. It was the French engineers, and more specifically, the French artillery. The French were recognized as having the best artillery in Europe. Their cannons were superior in design, their casting techniques were more advanced, and their gunners were trained in methods developed through decades of European warfare. And when they arrived at Yorktown, they brought this knowledge and these weapons with them. 18th century artillery may not seem particularly impressive by modern standards, but back then, it was the most destructive weapon available to armies. A single siege cannon could fire 8, 12, or even 24-pound iron balls over great distances. These balls could demolish fortifications, destroy buildings, and kill dozens of men with a single shot. The French brought heavy siege guns to Yorktown. They brought mortars that could launch explosive shells in high arcs, causing them to fall within enemy fortifications. They brought howitzers, a relatively new weapon at the time, which combined the characteristics of both cannons and mortars. Most importantly, they brought men who knew exactly how to use these weapons. The siege of Yorktown was essentially an artillery contest. Whoever could bombard the enemy most effectively, whoever could silence the enemy guns, whoever could destroy the enemy fortifications most quickly would win. And in this contest, the French and Americans held an overwhelming advantage. Washington and Rochambeau did not attack immediately. They knew that a direct assault on Cornwallis's fortifications would be extremely costly in terms of lives. Instead, they decided to conduct a formal siege following the siege warfare techniques that had been developed in Europe over centuries. The first step was to establish the first siege line, or first parallel as it was called. This was a long trench dug parallel to the enemy fortifications but at a safe distance from their guns. The soldiers worked through the night of October 6th, digging frantically while trying to remain silent. By dawn, they had created a trench over 3,000 meters long. Once the first parallel was established, the gunners began moving their cannons into position. This was extremely difficult work. Each cannon weighed hundreds or even thousands of kilograms. They had to be dragged across uneven ground, positioned precisely, and anchored firmly in the ground. But the French engineers knew exactly how to do this efficiently. On October 9th, the Allied guns were ready. Washington had the honor of firing the first shot. The cannonball flew through the air and struck a table where British officers were dining, killing one of them instantly. It was an ominous beginning to the bombardment to come. And then, all hell broke loose. More than 50 Allied guns and mortars opened fire on the British positions. The noise was deafening. The earth shook constantly. The sky grew dark with gunpowder smoke, and the British fortifications began to crumble under the relentless bombardment. The French gunners demonstrated their superior skill. They could calculate trajectories with remarkable accuracy. They could quickly adjust their fire based on where their balls landed. They could maintain a higher rate of fire than the British, and their cannons rarely exploded or malfunctioned, while British cannons frequently failed under the stress of constant use. The mortars were particularly terrifying. They fired bombs in high arcs, causing them to fall almost vertically into the British fortifications. These bombs were iron spheres filled with gunpowder and a lit fuse. When they exploded, fragments of metal flew in all directions, killing or injuring anyone nearby. And because they fell from above, there was no real protection against them. Even soldiers in deep trenches were in danger. Cornwallis attempted to respond to the Allied bombardment with his own cannons, but he was at a severe disadvantage. He had fewer cannons. His gunners were not as skilled as the French, and his positions were constantly being damaged by enemy bombardment. One by one, the British guns were silenced, destroyed by Allied cannonballs, or abandoned by their crews when their positions became untenable. After several days of constant bombardment, Washington and Rochambeau ordered the construction of the second parallel. This would be a trench even closer to the British fortifications from which Allied guns could fire with even greater effect. But there was a problem. Two British fortifications known as Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10 stood in the way of the planned second parallel. These redoubts were small but powerful fortifications positioned outside the main British defenses. They were garrisoned by determined soldiers armed with cannons and muskets. To build the second parallel, the Allies would need to capture these redoubts, and that meant a frontal assault. On the night of October 14th, Washington ordered simultaneous attacks on both redoubts. Redoubt 10 would be attacked by American troops commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, who would later become the first United States Secretary of the Treasury. Redoubt 9 would be attacked by French troops commanded by Baron de Viomenil. The attacks were planned to happen quickly and with as little gunfire as possible. The soldiers were instructed to rely primarily on their bayonets, advancing quickly and silently to surprise the defenders. It was a dangerous plan, but if well executed, it could work. At 8 in the evening, the attacks began. Hamilton led his men in a desperate rush toward Redoubt 10. The British spotted the attack and opened fire, but it was too late. The Americans reached the fortifications and began climbing the palisades. A fierce and bloody fight followed. Men fought hand to hand in the darkness. Bayonets gleamed in the moonlight, but the Americans, with superior numbers and momentum, quickly overwhelmed the defenders. The French attack on Redoubt 9 was equally successful. The disciplined and well-trained French troops advanced methodically against the fortifications. The British resisted courageously, but were quickly overwhelmed. In less than half an hour, both redoubts were in Allied hands. The capture of the redoubts was a devastating blow to Cornwallis. Now the second parallel could be completed, and once completed, the Allied guns would be so close to the main British fortifications that they would make Cornwallis's position completely untenable. Cornwallis knew he was in a desperate situation. He considered several options. Could he attempt an overland escape? But where to? The Allied army completely surrounded Yorktown. Could he try to sail past the French naval blockade? But with what ships? He had no suitable ships, and even if he had, the French fleet was simply too powerful. On October 16th, Cornwallis attempted a last desperate move. He decided to evacuate his troops across the York River at night, hoping to escape north and perhaps meet other British forces. The boats were prepared. The troops began to board silently. The first wave of soldiers successfully crossed the river, but then nature intervened. A sudden violent storm hit the area. High winds and rough waves made continuing the evacuation impossible. The boats that had already crossed the river could not return to pick up more soldiers. The operation had to be abandoned. The troops who had crossed had to return the next morning under Allied artillery fire. This was Cornwallis's last hope. With the evacuation attempt having failed, he had no other options. His fortifications lay in ruins. His guns had been silenced. His men were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. Disease was spreading among his troops, and with each passing day, the Allied bombardment grew more intense and more precise. On the morning of October 17, 1781, exactly 4 years after the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga, a British drummer climbed onto the ruins of a fortification and began playing the call to parley, the signal that they wanted to negotiate. The drumbeat was almost inaudible over the roar of the Allied guns, but eventually the gunners noticed and stopped firing. A British officer appeared with a white flag. He carried a letter from Cornwallis to Washington, requesting a 24-hour ceasefire to negotiate terms of surrender. Washington granted Cornwallis only 2 hours to present his proposed terms. The exchange of letters continued throughout the rest of the day and into the night. The next day, October 18th, representatives from both sides met at Moore House, a nearby home that had been spared the bombardment. They negotiated the specific terms of surrender. Cornwallis tried to obtain the best possible conditions for his men. Washington, holding the stronger position, was firm on many points but fair on others. The final terms were agreed upon. British troops would surrender their weapons and become prisoners of war. Officers would be allowed to keep their swords as a symbol of honor. Soldiers would be allowed to keep their personal belongings. Most importantly, British troops would not be allowed to march with their flags flying or playing a British or American march. This was significant because it denied the British the honors of war, a deliberate insult that mirrored how the British had treated the Americans when they captured Charleston the previous year. On October 19, 1781, the formal surrender ceremony took place. Thousands of Allied soldiers lined up in two columns, stretching more than a kilometer. On one side were the Americans, on the other, the French. Between the two lines, British troops marched to surrender their weapons. Cornwallis, humiliated and claiming illness, did not appear in person. He sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to hand over his sword in surrender. O'Hara first attempted to hand the sword to Rochambeau, apparently thinking it would be less humiliating to surrender to the French commander than to the American, but Rochambeau gestured toward Washington. O'Hara then attempted to deliver the sword directly to Washington, but Washington, in keeping with military protocol, refused to accept the sword personally from a Cornwallis subordinate. Instead, he appointed his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, to accept the surrender. It was a moment of dignity and precise protocol amidst a crushing victory. British troops marched between the American and French lines to a field where they were to deposit their weapons. Many of the British soldiers were openly weeping. Some tried to break their muskets by throwing them to the ground. Their officers shouted orders to maintain discipline. The British band played a tune appropriately titled "The World Turned Upside Down." And indeed, it had turned. The world's greatest military power had been defeated by a group of rebellious colonists. The army that had conquered territories on every continent had surrendered in a small coastal town in Virginia. And the weapon that had made this possible was the devastating combination of French naval power and French artillery, working in perfect coordination with American determination and leadership. More than 7,000 British soldiers were taken prisoner. Hundreds of cannons, thousands of muskets, and vast quantities of supplies were captured. But more important than the numbers was the psychological and political impact of the defeat. When news of Yorktown's surrender reached London, public support for continuing the war quickly evaporated. British Prime Minister Lord North, upon receiving the news, reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." And he was right. Although it would take another 2 years for a formal peace treaty to be negotiated and signed, Yorktown effectively marked the end of the American War of Independence. The British never mounted another major offensive in the Americas. Peace negotiations began the following year. The Treaty of Paris was finally signed in September 1783. It formally recognized the independence of the United States and established the new nation's borders. Great Britain ceded all territories south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River. It was a complete and total victory for the Americans. But let's reflect on the secret weapon that made all this possible. It wasn't a single thing, but a combination of factors. It was French naval power that blockaded Yorktown and prevented Cornwallis from receiving reinforcements or escaping. It was French artillery, superior in quality and operated by more skilled gunners, that destroyed the British fortifications. It was French military engineering that enabled the efficient establishment of the siege lines. But beyond the French technical contributions, there was something deeper. It was the international alliance itself. It was the idea that an established nation could support a revolution in another part of the world. It was the demonstration that idealism and national interests could align. The French supported the Americans partly out of revenge against the British, but also because they believed in the principles of the American Revolution. The artillery at Yorktown represented more than just firepower. It represented technical knowledge, military experience, and industrial resources. The French had developed their artillery superiority through decades of investment in scientific education, metallurgy, and military theory. They had established institutions like the École Polytechnique that trained engineers and artillerymen in the latest techniques. The Americans learned valuable lessons at Yorktown. They saw firsthand the value of well-trained and equipped artillery. They saw the importance of adequate fortifications and formal siege techniques. They saw how decisive coordination between land and naval forces could be. These lessons shaped American military development in the following decades. Alexander Hamilton, who led the attack on Redoubt 10 at Yorktown, would later advocate for the creation of an American military academy, an idea that eventually led to the founding of West Point. George Washington, based on his experience at Yorktown and throughout the war, advocated for the United States to have a permanent professional, albeit small, military force. The battle also demonstrated the importance of military logistics, moving 16,000 soldiers and their heavy siege weapons to Yorktown, keeping them supplied during the siege, and coordinating their actions was a remarkable logistical achievement. It required careful planning, adequate resources, and efficient execution. It was something in which the Europeans, particularly the French, had far more experience than the Americans. From a technological standpoint, the cannons used at Yorktown were the pinnacle of weapons technology at the time. They were made of bronze or cast iron, a process that required considerable skill to ensure the cannon was strong enough to withstand the explosion of gunpowder but not so heavy that it could not be moved. The caliber, the internal diameter of the barrel, had to be precisely matched to the size of the cannonballs to maximize range and accuracy. French gunners at Yorktown used advanced techniques to calculate trajectories. They considered factors such as gun angle, powder charge, ball weight, wind direction and strength, and even air temperature. Firing tables had been developed that allowed gunners to make rapid adjustments based on these variables. It was a combination of science and art that required years of training to master. The mortars used at Yorktown were particularly interesting from a technical standpoint. Unlike cannons, which fired relatively flat trajectories, mortars were designed to fire at high angles, sending their shells in parabolic arcs. This allowed them to fire over fortifications and hit protected targets, but it also made trajectory calculations much more complex. The bombs fired by mortars were terrifying weapons. They were hollow iron spheres filled with gunpowder with a small hole where a fuse was inserted. The fuse was lit before firing, and the time it took to burn was calculated to make the bomb explode at the ideal moment, preferably just after hitting the ground near the target. If the fuse was too long, the bomb would explode too late. If it was too short, it could explode in midair, reducing its effect. There was always the danger that a bomb wouldn't explode at all. Wet or damaged fuses could go out, leaving a deadly bomb on the ground. Brave teams would have to approach these unexploded bombs and try to make them safe, an extremely dangerous task. In some cases, defenders were even able to relight the fuse and send the bomb back to the attacker. The bombardment of Yorktown was relentless. During the days of the siege, it is estimated that more than 3,000 cannonballs and bombs were fired at the British positions. The noise was deafening and constant. British soldiers later reported that it was impossible to sleep or even think clearly under the continuous bombardment. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical damage. The British soldiers at Yorktown faced horrific conditions during the siege. In addition to the constant bombardment, they suffered from a lack of adequate food. Supplies were rapidly running low, and there was no hope of resupply with the French fleet blockading the harbor. The drinking water was contaminated. Diseases such as dysentery and fever spread through the overcrowded camps. The wounded could not receive adequate treatment because the field hospitals were constantly bombarded. Cornwallis tried to maintain his troops' morale, but it was a losing battle. His soldiers could see the thousands of Allied troops surrounding them. They could see the French fleet dominating the bay. They could hear the relentless bombardment from guns that were clearly superior to their own, and they knew deep in their hearts that there was no hope of victory or even escape. The superiority of French artillery wasn't just a matter of numbers. It was a matter of quality across the board. French cannons were cast using more advanced techniques, resulting in stronger, more reliable barrels. French gunpowder was of higher quality, providing more power and consistency. French cannonballs were more uniform in size and weight, improving accuracy, and French gunners were simply better trained. A French artilleryman's training was extensive and rigorous. They studied mathematics and geometry to understand ballistic trajectories. They constantly practiced loading and firing cannons until they could do so quickly, even under extreme pressure. They learned to quickly assess the distance to the target and adjust their fire accordingly. They studied the effects of different types of ammunition against different types of fortifications. Several types of ammunition were available to the gunners at Yorktown. Solid cannonballs were the most common, used primarily to destroy fortifications and buildings. Canister shot consisted of small metal balls or nails packed in a canister which scattered when fired, making it devastating against infantry formations. Explosive bombs were used to inflict area damage and terrify the enemy. And there were also hot shot, iron cannonballs heated to a red-hot state, used primarily against wooden ships to set them on fire. At Yorktown, the French demonstrated mastery in the use of all these types of ammunition. They knew precisely when to deploy each type for maximum effect. Against British fortifications, they used heavy solid balls to demolish the walls. Against troop concentrations, they used grape shot. To cause terror and widespread destruction, they used explosive bombs. It was a masterful display of applied technical knowledge. Coordination between the different artillery units was also exemplary. The French and Americans established an effective communication system that allowed them to concentrate fire from multiple guns on specific targets. When observers identified a key position, such as an active British gun or a weak spot in the fortifications, they could quickly direct concentrated fire at that location. This maximized damage and avoided wasting precious ammunition. French engineers also played a crucial role at Yorktown. They were responsible for designing and supervising the construction of the siege lines. This required in-depth knowledge of fortifications, topography, and siege tactics. They had to ensure that the trenches were deep enough to protect soldiers from enemy fire, but not so deep that they would fill with water. They had to be wide enough to allow the movement of troops and equipment, but not so wide that they required excessive earth to be dug. The trenches were constructed in a zigzag pattern to prevent enemy fire from traveling along their entire length. Gun positions were carefully prepared with parapets for protection. Batteries were positioned to provide cross-cover so that if one was silenced, others could continue the bombardment. The entire system was interconnected with communication trenches that allowed the safe movement of troops and supplies. Building these fortifications required immense labor. Thousands of soldiers worked night after night, digging into the hard earth with shovels and pickaxes. It was exhausting work, especially under occasional fire from British cannons that tried to disrupt their efforts. But French engineers had developed efficient methods that maximized progress while minimizing casualties. One method they used was sapping, a technique in which workers advanced their trenches toward the enemy while taking cover behind large earth-filled baskets called gabions. These gabions were positioned in front of the workers, providing protection from musket fire. As the trench advanced, more gabions were added. It was a slow but sure way to approach enemy fortifications. Another French technique was the use of fascines, bundles of branches tied together to reinforce trenches and fill ditches. They also used saucissons, long sausages of fascines that were placed along the top of the trenches for additional protection. These techniques had all been developed through centuries of European warfare and were applied to perfection at Yorktown. The French contribution to the victory at Yorktown cannot be overstated. Without the French ships, Cornwallis would never have been blockaded and could have escaped or received reinforcements. Without the French cannons and trained artillerymen, the British fortifications could have held out for much longer. Without the French engineers, the siege would not have been conducted as efficiently and effectively. And without the French troops, Washington simply would not have had enough numbers to completely surround Yorktown. But it's also important to recognize American contributions. American troops fought courageously and with determination. The attack on Redoubt 10, led by Alexander Hamilton, was brilliantly executed. George Washington's leadership was crucial in keeping the alliance with the French running smoothly and coordinating the complex operations of the siege. And it was the American cause, the fight for freedom and independence, that gave purpose to the entire effort. The Franco-American alliance at Yorktown was a remarkable example of international cooperation. There were challenges, of course. Language differences complicated communication. Cultural differences sometimes led to misunderstandings. The French were accustomed to a more formal European style of warfare, while the Americans were more improvisational and flexible. But both sides worked hard to overcome these differences and focus on the common goal. Rochambeau, the French commander, deserved special recognition for his diplomacy and tact. He had more military experience than Washington and commanded better trained and equipped troops. He could easily have insisted on assuming overall command, but he recognized that to maintain the alliance's strength, it was important for Washington to be seen as the supreme commander. Rochambeau consistently deferred to Washington on matters of overall strategy, even when offering advice based on his vast experience. Admiral de Grasse also deserves immense credit. His decision to bring his fleet to the Chesapeake Bay rather than to New York as Washington had originally requested was crucial. De Grasse recognized that blocking Cornwallis at Yorktown offered the best opportunity for a decisive victory. He was willing to risk his fleet in a confrontation with the British Navy, and his victory in the Battle of the Chesapeake made everything else possible. De Grasse's fleet not only blockaded Yorktown, but also transported additional French troops from the Caribbean. It brought crucial supplies, including gunpowder and ammunition. It provided naval artillery support during parts of the siege, and its mere presence was a constant reminder to Cornwallis that he was completely isolated and without hope of rescue. It's fascinating to consider how the victory at Yorktown depended on the convergence of so many different factors at the right time and place. Had de Grasse arrived just a few days later, Cornwallis might have been alerted and evacuated. Had the storm not interrupted Cornwallis's attempted escape across the river, he might have escaped with at least part of his army. Had the British in New York realized earlier that Washington was marching south, they might have attacked his supply lines or sent reinforcements to Cornwallis. History is full of these moments where seemingly small events have enormous consequences. A delayed messenger, an unexpected storm, a decision made in a moment of uncertainty. All these elements combined at Yorktown to create a decisive victory that changed the course of world history. Consider the long-term consequences of Yorktown. American independence led to the creation of a new form of government based on democratic principles and individual rights. The United States Constitution, ratified just a few years after Yorktown, became a model for democracies worldwide. The ideals of liberty and equality proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence inspired revolutions and reform movements around the globe. The victory at Yorktown also had consequences for France. The cost of supporting the American Revolution contributed significantly to the financial crisis that eventually led to the French Revolution. French soldiers who fought in America brought back ideas about liberty and equality that helped fuel the desire for change in France. In a real sense, Yorktown helped sow the seeds of the revolution that would transform France itself just a few years later. For Britain, Yorktown was a humiliating but not fatal blow. Although they lost their American colonies, the British retained a vast global empire. They learned valuable lessons about the limitations of military power and the importance of maintaining political support. In the following decades, they adjusted their colonial policies, becoming more flexible and less autocratic in many areas. The military technology demonstrated at Yorktown continued to evolve rapidly in the following decades. Artillery became even more powerful and accurate. New types of fortifications were developed to withstand bombardment from heavier cannons. Siege tactics continued to be refined. Eventually, the invention of explosive shells, rifled cannons, and other innovations would completely transform warfare. But in 1781, the cannons and mortars used at Yorktown represented the state-of-the-art. They were the most destructive weapons available, capable of demolishing fortifications that had taken months to build. And in the hands of well-trained French gunners, supported by skilled engineers, and coordinated with overwhelming naval power. They were utterly devastating. The secret weapon that destroyed the Redcoats at Yorktown wasn't secret in the traditional sense. The British knew the French had a powerful navy. They knew the French artillery was excellent. They knew the French engineers were skilled. What they didn't expect was that all these elements would be combined so effectively, coordinated so perfectly, and applied with such concentrated force in a single decisive location. Cornwallis had assumed that British naval superiority would protect Yorktown. He had assumed that his fortifications could withstand any siege until reinforcements arrived. He had assumed that the Americans lacked the discipline, organization, or equipment necessary to conduct a formal European-style siege. All of these assumptions were wrong, and the Franco-American alliance proved this dramatically and decisively. The surrender at Yorktown was not just a military defeat for the British. It was a psychological and political defeat. It demonstrated that the British Empire was not invincible. It demonstrated that determined colonies with adequate international support could win their independence. It proved that the ideals of freedom and self-determination were more powerful than sheer military force. For the soldiers who fought at Yorktown, both American and French, it was a moment of incredible triumph. They had faced what was widely considered the best army in the world, and had won. Many of these soldiers would carry the memories of Yorktown for the rest of their lives. Some would become political and military leaders in the new American nation. Others would return to France and participate in their own revolution. They all knew they had participated in something truly historic. The importance of artillery at Yorktown set a precedent for future wars. It became clear that well-used artillery could be decisive in sieges and battles. Armies around the world began investing more heavily in artillery and artillery training. Military academies expanded their mathematics and engineering curricula to better prepare officers to command artillery units. Warfare was becoming more technical, more scientific, and more dependent on specialized knowledge. Yorktown also demonstrated the critical importance of naval power. The French fleet's ability to blockade the harbor and defeat the British fleet that attempted to break the blockade was absolutely essential to victory. This did not go unnoticed by American leaders. In the following years, there were intense debates about whether the United States should build its own powerful navy. Eventually, they decided it should, leading to the creation of the United States Navy, which today is the most powerful in the world. The cooperation between land and naval forces demonstrated at Yorktown was also revolutionary for its time. Coordinating operations between the Army and Navy was notoriously difficult. They had separate commands, different cultures, and often conflicting objectives. But at Yorktown, Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse worked together seamlessly, each understanding and supporting the other's roles. It was a model of joint operations that would be studied and imitated by generations of military strategists. The lessons of Yorktown remain relevant today. The importance of international alliances, the need for technological superiority, the value of competent leadership, the critical nature of coordination between different military branches, all these principles demonstrated at Yorktown remain fundamental to modern military thought. But perhaps the most important lesson from Yorktown is one of determination and perseverance. The Americans had fought for 6 long years against seemingly impossible odds. They had suffered devastating defeats. They had endured brutal winters, famine, disease, and despair. Many of them had lost everything: their homes, their farms, their livelihoods. But they never gave up on the cause they fought for. George Washington in particular embodies this determination. He had commanded the Continental Army through its darkest hours. He had held his army together when it seemed it would disintegrate. He had inspired his men to keep fighting when victory seemed impossible. And at Yorktown, he finally saw his perseverance rewarded with a decisive and complete victory. The story of Yorktown is ultimately a story about the power of ideas. The men who fought there weren't just fighting for territory or wealth. They were fighting for principles. They believed that all men were created equal. They believed in liberty, in self-determination, in government by the consent of the governed. These ideas were powerful enough to inspire them to risk everything. And these ideas proved more powerful than the British Empire's cannons and muskets, because while military force can conquer territory, it cannot conquer hearts and minds. The British learned this the hard way at Yorktown. They might have the best army and navy in the world, but they faced a people willing to sacrifice everything for their freedom. The victory at Yorktown would not have been possible without French assistance, the artillery, the engineers, the ships, the troops. But the reason the French helped, the reason French soldiers were willing to die for a cause that was not theirs, was because they too believed in these ideals of liberty and equality. Yorktown was a victory not just for America, but for these universal ideals. As we conclude this journey through the Battle of Yorktown and discover the secret weapon that destroyed the Redcoats, we must remember that history is not just about weapons and tactics. It is about people. It is about their hopes, their dreams, their courage, and their sacrifice. The men who fought at Yorktown, both victors and losers, were real human beings with families, fears, and aspirations. Many of them never returned home. They lie buried on American soil, far from their loved ones. But their sacrifice was not in vain. They helped create a new nation based on principles that continue to inspire people around the world more than 2 centuries later. They proved that power comes not only from weapons but from ideas and the will to defend them. The secret weapon at Yorktown was, yes, the combination of French naval power and superior artillery. But more profoundly, it was the alliance between people who shared a vision of a better world. It was the determination of ordinary men to do extraordinary things. It was proof that when people unite for a just cause, they can overcome any obstacle. And so, as we reflect on Yorktown and its place in history, we should be grateful. Grateful for those who fought and died for our freedom. Grateful for the wisdom of the leaders who knew when to seek allies and when to risk everything in a decisive battle. Grateful for the providence that brought so many elements together at just the right time to create the victory that changed the world. We must thank the Lord God for His divine providence, which guided the events that led to freedom and independence. For the courage He granted to soldiers who faced danger. For the wisdom He gave to leaders who made crucial decisions. For the storm He sent to prevent Cornwallis's escape. For every small miracle that combined to make victory at Yorktown possible. We thank Him for His invisible hand in history, guiding events according to His greater purposes. All glory and honor belong to Him who makes the impossible possible and who continues to guide nations to this day. May we always recognize His sovereignty over all things and be grateful for His countless blessings.